Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is part 2 of the Introduction to the PMI process table. Now let's take a closer look at the processes row by row, knowledge area by knowledge area, beginning with integration management. The first process in the integration management knowledge area, and in the whole process table for that matter, is the develop project charter process, which establishes the high-level overview of the project and authorizes the project. Next comes the develop project management plan process, which is the overarching document that includes the project management plans from all of the other knowledge areas, each of which provides the details of how to manage its knowledge area. Direct and manage project work takes care of the management of the scope, schedule, and cost, and the coordination of the rest of the executing processes of the other knowledge areas. Manage project knowledge is primarily concerned with the lessons learned register. This is a new process that used to be part of other processes, but which is now been identified as a separate process to emphasize its importance. Monitor and control project work provides the oversight and integration of the other monitoring and controlling processes of the other knowledge areas. Perform integrated change control is the process that considers and makes decisions on change requests. Finally, the close project or phase process is the single process that integrates all project closure activities, except, as mentioned earlier, for closing contracts and procurements, which is included in the control procurements process. Integration management is the only knowledge area that includes processes in all 5 process groups. Don't worry, this is just a quick overview. We'll dive into the details of each of these processes later in the course. Although this knowledge area is still called stakeholder management, the names of the processes and the stakeholder-related deliverables have been changed to use the word engagement rather than management, to more accurately reflect the relationship between the stakeholders and the project. Stakeholders need to be engaged in the project rather than managed. Early on in the initiating process group comes the identify stakeholders process. Key stakeholders are identified and included in the project charter, but more stakeholders are identified in the Identify Stakeholders process. Then comes Plan Stakeholder Engagement, followed by Manage Stakeholder Engagement, in which the plan is put into action, and the Monitor Stakeholder Engagement, which monitors the effectiveness of the Manage Stakeholder Engagement process. Notice that some monitoring and controlling processes use the verb monitoring, while others use controlling. This depends mostly on what makes sense for the particular knowledge area. It makes more sense to monitor rather than control stakeholder engagement, just as it makes more sense to speak of stakeholder engagement than stakeholder management. You may also notice that stakeholder management is the only knowledge area that includes processes in 4 of the 5 process groups. All of the others include processes in 2 or 3 process groups. As you can see, although the stakeholder management knowledge area is listed last in the process table, it's important enough and addressed early enough that it should be listed near the top. In fact, stakeholder management didn't used to be its own knowledge area, but was later added to emphasize its importance. But it was added to the end of the already existing list of knowledge areas. The Communications Management knowledge area includes 3 processes, 1 in each of the planning, executing, and monitoring and controlling process groups. They are Plan Communications Management, Manage Communications, and Monitor Communications. Although not listed in this order in the process table, I like to group Communications Management with Stakeholder Management because Communications Management is all about effectively communicating with stakeholders, and the analysis of the communication needs of stakeholders naturally coincides with other analysis of stakeholders, such as their interest and influence on the project. So it makes sense to plan these at the same time. Next comes scope management. Managing scope and preventing scope creep, which is the unmanaged changes to scope, involves several distinct steps, which are represented in the process table by 4 scope planning processes. Plan scope management, which defines how scope will be managed during the project. Collect requirements, which defines what the stakeholders want. Define scope, which defines the detailed scope of the project, which will typically not include all of the desired requirements. And create WBS, which organizes the project scope into a hierarchy with accompanying details. As mentioned earlier, the management of executing the project scope is handled in the Direct and Manage Project Work process, which is in the Integration Management knowledge area. The Scope Management knowledge area includes 2 monitoring and controlling processes: Validate Scope and Control Scope. Validate Scope is about getting stakeholder approval and acceptance of project deliverables, and Control Scope monitors the status of the scope and manages changes to the scope baseline. As with scope management, schedule management planning includes several distinct steps represented by 5 planning processes. Plan schedule management defines how the project schedule will be managed. Define activities, as you have probably guessed, defines the activities needed to deliver the project's end result, as well as those activities needed to manage the project. Sequence activities puts these activities into a logical order or network diagram. This does not include the activity durations, not yet. Those are added during the Estimate Activity Durations process. Once all of this is done, plus with some input from some other processes in other knowledge areas, such as Estimate Activity Resources, the Develop Schedule process creates the project schedule. As with scope management, the schedule management's executing processes are included in Integration Management's Direct and Manage Project Work process. Finally, we have Control Schedule, which is similar to the Control Scope process, in which this monitors the status of the project and updates to the project schedule and any changes made to the schedule baseline. Cost management also has a few steps. Plan cost management defines how the project costs will be managed. Estimate costs, which estimates the costs of the project activities defined in the Define Activities process of schedule management. And Determine budget, which combines it all into a project budget. As with scope and schedule management, the executing processes of cost management are included in the Integration Management's Direct and Manage Project Work process. And finally, we have the Control Costs process, which monitors the status of the project costs and manages changes to the project cost baseline. The Quality Management knowledge area includes Plan Quality Management, which defines how quality will be managed, and Manage Quality, which implements the planned quality activities. Again, this is a very proactive approach. And Control Quality, which measures and monitors the quality of the project work and the project management, and ensures that the project outputs meet the defined requirements and customer expectations. The Resource Management knowledge area includes Plan Resource Management, which, you guessed it, defines how resources will be managed, and Estimate Activity Resources, which is performed along with Estimate Activity Durations from Schedule Management and Estimate Costs from Cost Management. As you can imagine, this is an iterative process that may involve considering different alternatives in resourcing in order to arrive at the best balance of cost and duration. Resource management includes the management of both team members and physical assets. In the executing process group, we have acquire resources as the process of acquiring both team members and other resources needed for the project. Develop team is specifically for team members and includes many best practices of improving competencies, interactions, and the team environment that we'll cover later in the course. Manage team, like development team, is specifically for team members and includes tracking member performance, providing feedback, resolving any issues, and managing any changes to the team. Finally, we have the control resources process that is specifically for physical resources, not team members. The risk management knowledge area includes several planning processes. Plan risk management, which of course defines how the project risks will be managed. Identify risks, which starts off the risk register with a list of identified risks and some initial information about them. Perform qualitative risk analysis, which prioritizes risks for further action or analysis. Perform quantitative risk analysis, which quantifies project risks, usually in terms of dollars. And plan risk responses. In the executing process group, we have implement risk responses. And in the monitoring and controlling process group, we have monitor risks to assess how well risk responses are working, keeping an eye on risks, identifying and analyzing new risks, and evaluating the effectiveness of risk management in general. In the Procurement Management Knowledge Group, we have Plan Procurement Management, which includes the identification of potential sellers. Conduct procurements, which includes the whole process of soliciting bids, evaluating responses, selecting sellers, and awarding contracts. And finally, control procurements, which includes all of the management of procurement after contracts have been awarded, including relationships, performance, changes, and finally, closing out contracts. Larger organizations typically have procurement departments which will take the lead in conducting and controlling procurements, with, of course, input and involvement from the project manager. Each of the processes in the process table is defined using this framework of inputs to the process, outputs from the process, and the tools and techniques for creating these outputs. These are often referred to as the inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs, or ITTOs. Please don't try to memorize all of the ITTOs of all of the processes. We'll cover this material in a way that you can understand it so that you can remember it or figure it out. To know what would be useful inputs, tools, and techniques in order to create the outputs that you need. So you won't need to try to memorize them all. Also, note that these ITTOs are not as prescriptive as they may seem. The processes don't always use all of the listed tools and techniques, or inputs for that matter. More importantly, the lists of inputs, tools, and techniques are not meant to be complete. The lists only show those that are often used, but other items not on these lists may also be used. In fact, if you look in the PMbok guide, the introductions to most of these lists include a phrase something like include but are not limited to. For example, in this diagram of the Develop Project Charter process, there may not be any agreements relevant to your particular project if the work is all to be done by a small internal team with no need for help from other departments or resources from outside your organization. The PMbok guide says that, quote, data gathering techniques that can be used for this process include, but are not limited to, brainstorming, focus groups, and interviews, end quote. You may find it useful on some projects to use other tools and techniques, such as surveys, questionnaires, and others that we'll cover later in the course. Just because it isn't listed doesn't mean you can't or shouldn't use it. And some things that are listed are not always needed. Of course, some things are, particularly when it comes to the key inputs and outputs of processes, such as, in this case, the project charter being the essential output of the develop project charter process. The bottom line is, remember that these ITTOs are guidelines and not hard and fast rules set in stone. The PMbok guide summarizes the best practices in project management. Best practices are those which are considered to be of benefit to most projects most of the time. Best practices do not include all good practices that may be useful on some projects some of the time. Different projects have different needs. Some will need much more process than others in some areas and less in other areas. Project managers will usually follow a specific project management methodology, such as Scrum or Prince2. There are many excellent methodologies out there that are a good fit for particular projects and particular organizations and cultures. Project management is not a one-size-fits-all discipline. The more familiar you are with the project management body of knowledge, which is much more than is found in the PMbok guide, and the various project management methodologies, the better you'll be able to help your organization tailor best practices, good practices, and methodologies to your particular project and to your organization, culture, and situation. To summarize, PMI has organized the project management processes into 5 process groups: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. They've also organized the project management processes into 10 knowledge areas: integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communications, risk, procurement, and stakeholder. Remember that project management processes are iterative, that more than one process will frequently be done in parallel, and that during the life of the project, you'll often go back and revisit or reapply previous processes, such as when changes are made and scope, schedule, and cost need to be redefined and re-estimated. Each process is presented using the framework of inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. Keep in mind that these are useful guidelines, but not strict rules. Don't try to memorize them. Instead, try to understand them. Instead, your goal should be to understand them. Finally, project management is not a one-size-fits-all discipline. There is no universal set of processes, tools, and techniques that applies equally to all projects. And there is no single methodology that is best for all projects, organizations, and situations. Here are some pages in the PMbok guide that you can review to crystallize and deepen your understanding of these topics. This concludes Part 2 of the Introduction to the PMI Process Table. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMbok Guide.